Good morning. Welcome back to our plenary session room. We hope that you've had a good morning. Thank you also too for your participation at dinner last night. For those who attended, I'm sure that you had a fab time. We had people rocking their dancing shoes till about 11:15, and everybody else seemed to have a lovely night. So I'm most grateful to the Chapakai and their hospitality at the venue last night. So here we are. Sadly, the conference is drawing to a close. After so much work and effort, it's so great to see it set off and doing well, but it's also a little bit sad to see it coming to a finish. But it's great to see so many of you here in the room to be able to join in the conversation around the question that we're putting to our stellar lineup of panellists, which is leaving no one behind. What are the practical steps that can be taken to meet this aspirational objective? So I'm very delighted today that we have joining us with Senator Jenny McAllister, who is the Shadow Assistant Minister for Families and Communities. So thank you, Jenny, for making the trip. Megan Mitchell, who's the National Children's Commissioner, and glad that she's with us here today as well, and found her way to dinner last night, which was very nice. We have Deb Hartman, who is a member of the FRSA board, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a minute, and Hollonds, the Director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and Dr. Stephen Crossley, who I'm sure many of you will recall, gave us a very enlightening presentation on the first day of the conference and joins the panel here with us today. So to put the big question to these panellists is our member of the FRSA board, Dr. Deb Hartman. Deb is the Assistant Director of the Family Action Centre at the University of Newcastle, and as a long-term member of the leadership team at the Family Action Centre, Deb has been involved in service delivery, teaching, research, governance, strategic planning, staff development and financial and human resource management in the family services sector for over 19 years. The Family Action Centre is a unique, multidisciplinary, multifunctional centre in the Faculty of Health and Medicine, which undertakes teaching, research and direct service delivery, built upon empirical and theoretical research frameworks and implementation science with the aim of supporting strong families and capable communities. She is a leader of the Family Action Centre's role in the Federal Government Expert Panel on Families and Children, and also coordinates the International Family Studies specialisation in the Master of Family Studies. In this role, she is a member of the Global Consortium for International Family Studies, a consortium of universities with a focus on teaching and research in family studies. Deb is chair of the Academic Committee of the Global Consortium for International Family Studies, and in this role has instigated international research partnerships with the aim of strengthening the mental health and well-being of rural and remote families. So I invite you to join me in welcoming Deb and hand over to her for the panel discussion. Thank you.
So the short version is, I'm really old. Thanks everybody and welcome to this final plenary session. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand and their elders past, present and emerging. And this is the final plenary. We've had outstanding, challenging keynotes, amazingly insightful panels, incredibly creative and innovative presentations in the concurrent sessions, and now it's up to us to make sure that no one's left behind and to do the roadmap of the practical steps to lay it out and the way forward for our ambitious goal. But we don't want you to feel any pressure. So, this week there's been a lot of talk about the need for collaborating and crossing boundaries and breaking down silos. And on this panel, we've got most of the silos represented. The big influencers in the field. We've got politics, we've got advocacy, we've got policy research, we've got academia, and we've got practice. I guess all we're missing is the families. And though all of us are members of families, none of us are here today representing our family. So perhaps that's a missing voice and we've already identified our first step, and that's to be more inclusive. It occurred to me that it would be a good start to leave no one behind if all those layers in the field could really hear each other's perspectives. So that's our challenge on this panel today, to put our heads together and to listen to each other and to listen to you. And I'm confident that together we'll be able to come up with some parting words that will move us all into action and to leave here with the commitment to be the change that we want to see. But in my experience, change is not so easy, even when you want it. So I've been reflecting on some of the challenges that have been thrown to us this week, challenges to our sector. Now, I have to admit that this reflection happened very late last night, so I was thinking of the word staying alive in my head. And I sympathise with those of you who think that's the most you can manage at this stage of the conference. But really, the first big challenge to me was the reminder that Jackie Huggins so gracefully gave us, even though she must be very sick of repeating it, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples do have the solutions. She invited us to work closely with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak bodies and community organisations. And so in thinking about the first step that I can take as a board member of FRSA, I can commit to making a concerted effort to walk beside and work with the peak bodies and to advocate for their needs to be met and to implement the principles that she outlined to us. It's in the FRSA strategic plan, and we commit to doing that. Howard Bath challenged us to focus on healthy developmental growth and on what we do well, which is to work relationally. Both Howard and Stephen challenged us to be careful of programs and approaches that label families that are experiencing problems in this moment as being the problem forever. Both Howard and Stephen reminded us of the evidence that the majority of problems are likely to come from external structural forces leading to the internal stress in families. And Dr. Andrew Bickerdike and Judge Joe Hartman reminded us that there was plenty of work to do in reforming the family law field. And they gave us an excellent example of a public health approach in that sphere. Judge Myers reminded us that we can do what the courts can't. But to do that, we have to walk across those silos. Lawyers, FDRPs, relationship counsellors, family practitioners. We have to work together. My challenge after 30 years of long experience is to keep hopeful. Most families are happy and well-functioning most of the time, and all families have struggles and problems some of the time. So we can acknowledge their strengths and we can share the power with them because we do relationships really well. So all of the speakers challenged us to stand up for what we believe in and to resist those dodgy programs and processes suggested or imposed by government, competitive tendering, payment by results, that's just to name a few that comes off the top of my head. If we're going to leave no one behind, we're going to have a greater role in advocacy, which we used to do before that was written out of our funding agreements. And we're going to have a bigger focus on the impact of poverty and its link to homelessness, family violence and family stress. Some of us are old enough to remember Bob Hawke's commitment to no child will live in poverty. Now there's a good aspirational goal for a senator and a children's commissioner. No child would live in poverty. So let's continue to advocate for a public health approach in our sector, to advocate for more funding that would allow us to do universal prevention work, to work together to set our own agenda and to think about the measures that we would like to see, what difference we'd like to see. So I'd like to invite to this exciting discussion about what are the next steps. I'd like to welcome into the conversation Senator Jenny McAllister, Shadow Assistant Member for Families and Communities, Ms Megan Mitchell, National Children's Commissioner, Ms Anne Hollonds, the Director of the Australian Institute for Family Studies, and Dr Stephen Crossley, Senior Lecturer at Northumbria University. Won't you join with me in welcoming them all to this final plenary session? And now I'll call on Senator Jenny McAllister to kick us off.
Thank you, Deb, very much. And can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present also. I want to congratulate Family and Relationship Services Australia for what is obviously a terrific conference. I was only here this morning and heard some of the presentations, but there's obviously a vast depth of knowledge and experience here. Thank you, Jackie, very much for issuing, I don't know where Jackie's gone, there she is. Thank you, Jackie, so much for asking me to come up. I'm really glad to have the opportunity actually to speak with you all. I am relatively new as the Shadow Assistant Minister for Families and Communities, and I will concede that there are quite a lot of words in that title and it's not entirely clear what that means. But the simplest way to describe is that on the Labor side, I'm responsible for thinking about the work that's done by that part of the community sector that's funded by the Department of Social Services. And I'm taking a rough guess that that might not be all of you, but I think it would be a good many of you in the organisations that you work within. Since I took the role a couple of months ago, the sector's been incredibly generous with time and expertise, and I've met with a lot of people already, and I'm really struck by how trusting all of you have been in honestly sharing with me your experiences working in community, but also working with government. I'm very grateful for your willingness to share those insights with me so far. The panel, like the conference, has been asked to consider what it would take to make sure that nobody is left behind. And I want to be frank about what it really means to leave nobody behind. It would mean dealing with poverty and the social exclusion that comes with it. And there are people who unequivocally have been left behind in Australia. This year, the Productivity Commission released a report into inequality in Australia, and it's a complex piece of work that generated some debate at the time it was released. But what it makes clear is that there is a hard kernel of extreme disadvantage in Australia. The bottom decile has remained pretty much in poverty for decades, and the then chair of the Commission, Peter Harris, made clear at the report's launch, for 2 million people or so, we are where we are 30 years ago. And their poverty expresses itself in housing insecurity, in job insecurity, in food insecurity. And their poverty expresses itself through their children, whose lives that it touches. And I think you would know better than most what the literature says about the devastating effect poverty can have on young developing minds. And this is not just playing out at the margins, it's at the heart of our largest cities. And if you can indulge me in a little bit of parochialism and talking a little bit about my home state of New South Wales, about half the children in the Western Sydney suburbs of Bankstown, Liverpool and Fairfield are living in households with incomes below the poverty line. And that pattern repeats itself across the country. Our public discussion, I think, is yet to come to grips with the implications of that PC report into inequality. I don't think its core message would be new to anyone in the room. It's nothing that you wouldn't see from the work that you do. You and your organisations offer a range of services to a range of different people, but a common theme, I suspect, cuts across the worst cases that come before you, and that is poverty. Poverty is amongst the causes and the consequences of many of the situations that you deal with. and you would know better than most how poverty can act as an amplifier for the existing problems faced by vulnerable families and individuals. And those cases should be a clarion call for action. We had a little discussion on the panel beforehand about whether this would be an optimistic or a depressing discussion. And I tend to be a glass half full person when it comes to politics, and I am actually very optimistic about the opportunities that present at the moment. I think there is a growing public appetite here and internationally for action that will address poverty and inequality. And at the same time, there is a growing awareness of some of the intersecting factors. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse has refocused attention, rightly, on the rights and agency of children. The Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence is likewise a monumental piece of work, and I think many political people and policymakers are genuinely stunned by the extent of the problem. That Royal Commission has served to elevate the issue of family violence, and it's placed a clear challenge on the record for government to answer. And I think these three movements around children, around domestic violence and around poverty present a real political opportunity by throwing these issues into very stark relief. I've been involved in organised politics in one form or another probably for more than 2 decades. And it's the first time I've seen this confluence of forces and the first time I've seen the level of public interest in tackling them. So the question, I think, for all of us is what are we going to do about this moment? Because making the most of a political opportunity would require, I think, genuine partnership between government, between political people and the community sector. The community sector is at the heart of how Australia has come to deliver social services. You're embedded in the service delivery in many communities, and you also operate as a deep reservoir for on-the-ground practical experience that can drive advocacy. And one of the key challenges for government is to create the conditions that are needed for the community sector to have an impact. And there are a number of discrete policy changes that would allow this, but broadly what is required is a relationship that is based on trust, reciprocity and shared objectives. If we were to achieve this, the interactions between the community sector and government need to transcend a narrow focus on tendering and retendering. Government will need to embrace a role that is much greater than that of contract management. Government would need to embrace the idea of a partnership that is based on shared responsibility for service delivery. And I know that a partnership of that kind is not easy for any party. It would demand ongoing high performance from both government and the community sector. But I think that that is something that we could and should work towards. As important as the community sector is, there are some things that only government can do. And if you think about the tools and the levers that are available for any Commonwealth government, you can start to have a look at what a comprehensive response to poverty might look like. We need action to address income. The Commonwealth Government takes responsibility for ensuring every family has a basic level of income to support them. And when we were last in government, we lifted the aged pension, and this time we know that we need to tackle New Start. But it wouldn't be complete, that action, without action on wages also, especially in low-paid sectors. I visited Foodbank's warehouse a couple of months ago in Sydney, and they make the point that food assistance is not actually just for unemployed people or homeless people. Their survey work suggests that 20% of people who are in part-time or casual work experienced issues accessing food in the last year. This is not because people are failing to manage their budgets. There is a working poor in this country that cannot feed their families. We also need action to improve access to services. These primary interventions made by Commonwealth governments to provide healthcare and education and other legal and counselling services for families like the ones many of you are involved in. This universal piece is very important. The federal government is really the only part of government that can deliver that, and it is one of the reasons why we plan very significant investments in public education, in public health, and I'd make special reference to universal preschool education for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. But for families that are in deep structural poverty, this won't be enough. some families face a kind of intergenerational disadvantage. That means that they won't emerge with support without receiving support that goes beyond financial support and universal services. And this is where early intervention, preventative action comes in. On this, I think the Commonwealth has the opportunity to lead. The reality is that responsibility for programs of this kind are distributed across our federation, and the states do not always pull in the same direction as one another or in the same direction as the Commonwealth. There is real merit in the experimentation that comes about from competitive federalism. But there are also opportunities for the Commonwealth Government to step up and take action to coordinate action across the Federation. We have enormous power to effect change through just exercising that central coordination role. And I have been particularly keen in the last few months to ask pretty much anyone who'll accept the question or sit down and meet with me, what have we achieved through the National Framework for Protecting Australia's Children, and what ought the next framework look like when that framework expires in a couple of years' time? So this is a big action list, it's a broad agenda, and if we're honest, it's only the start of what needs to be done. There are no certainties about us forming government after the next election, but if we do, there will be a great deal of work to do to clean up after a government that, on its best day, is uninterested in social services and at its worst day is actively hostile. I am looking forward to the discussion this afternoon. I do approach it optimistically, and as Deb said, I'm also looking forward to truly listening and hearing your perspectives and your questions.
Thank you, Jenny. Hi, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're gathering on here today. I'd like to acknowledge the fellow panellists and acknowledge Jackie for inviting me here and putting on such a fabulous show. And just so you know, I've got video of Nutbush city limits from last night, so I'm going to use it somehow, I don't know how. So I just wanted to start by saying that if we don't want to leave children behind, they first need to be visible and in the picture. Their rights need to be at the centre of the thoughts and actions of policymakers, program designers and practitioners. So as National Children's Commissioner, my job is to promote the rights of children and young people and act as their advocate. And there are 5.5 million of them around Australia, so it's no mean feat. I often say to kids that I meet, you're the boss of me, so tell me what you want and I'll pass on your views to all the people in Canberra that wish to listen. So that's how I look at my role. It's really important that Australians, including Australian adults, understand that children are rights holders and that adults have a duty to ensure that these rights are upheld. These are basic to all of us, these rights, like being safe, having a family, understanding where we come from, having access to health and education, to privacy, to play, and to be treated fairly and with respect. Basic things that we all need and children need to thrive and do well in life. And the guiding document for my work is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Australia ratified this over 27 years ago, and I'll come back to that just at the end of my 10 minutes. So Article 12 of the Convention, which some of you might be familiar with, and arguably is the gateway to all other rights, relates to the importance of children's voices and the capacity to participate as active citizens and in the decisions that affect them. However, I have to say that within Australian service and legal systems, children's rights, needs and interests are really rarely given prominence, and where they are, they're narrowly articulated and implemented. Because of this, children face significant barriers to being a genuine focus and having their voices heard. These barriers include negative assumptions about children's capacities, risk aversion, and a lack of suitable avenues through which children and young people can express themselves. Australia's family law system, of which some of you are a part, is a case in point. In a recent report on separated families published by the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and this directly asked children about their experiences, children and young people consistently indicated that the system and the adults in the system are largely letting them down. They want more visibility, more information, and more opportunities for participation. So, for example, some of the findings were most children, that's 76%, wanted parents to listen more to their views in relation to parenting arrangements. More than a third of children and young people wanted ongoing communication with parents and others to understand more about what was going on during and after separation. Children and young people said they would like to be kept informed about the process. This involved knowing more about who was representing their parents, who, if anyone, was representing them, what the possible outcomes were, and who was determining the parenting arrangements. One of the primary means of protecting children's safety and interests within any system is to ensure that they are able to express their concerns and views and have these responded to. This remains one of the key takeaway messages from the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And in my conversations with children and young people affected by the separation of their families over the years, some of the things they've said to me as they've come and talked to me were they felt they had no rights and their voice wasn't important. They felt disempowered. The system was adult-focused. They weren't properly listened to and didn't feel they were believed. They felt that an adult's word was taken over theirs. That some of the people, like independent children's lawyers, were scary and not appropriate for children, and that they didn't contact them or ask them for their views. The processes, the roles of different people in the system and how they could participate were not properly explained to them. And they didn't understand why in the end the judge made the decisions they did, or how their views were considered, or what would happen next. And being involved with courts in particular over many years was really bad for children. And one of the consequences of all of this experience of kids is that they leave that system with not a great deal of trust in the authority of those systems that they've been a part of, including the judicial system. So even when they have had the opportunity to meet with, say, an independent lawyer or a family consultant, many have been disappointed in the process and report being uncertain about what these roles do. And also they constantly report that their views had been filtered or misinterpreted. So there's one girl from a previous study sponsored by the Australian Attorney General's Department. A girl said, it was all pretty bad. Probably she didn't just listen. Like, she would ask us questions and we'd tell her, but then she just didn't care what we said and she ignored what we said. And then another girl said in meeting an ICL, I met her once, we shook hands, she said her name and left. That was it. As you know, the Australian Law Reform Commission is currently undertaking a review of the family law system. And in that submission, in our submission to that review, the Human Rights Commission has highlighted a number of factors that prevent children from genuinely participating. So some of those are that the Family Law Act only references the Convention on the Rights of the Child in the section on parenting orders. The reality is, as for all of us, children's rights and needs are not confined or compartmentalised in this way. There's nothing in the Act that requires anyone to provide a child with an opportunity to express their views, only to consider any views that may be expressed through an intermediary. The ICL is not required to provide a child with an opportunity to express a view, but only to ensure that any views expressed by the child are fully put before the court. And although family consultants and ICLs and others play a crucial role in relaying children's views to the courts, they are concerned about whether they are sufficiently qualified in relation to child development and trauma or child-centred in their approach. Lastly, there are limited avenues for which children can make complaints or raise concerns about negative experiences and not having their right to be heard respected within the family law system. So from what kids have told me, it's clear that they need to be at the centre, and they want to be at the centre of the processes that determine their futures and given opportunities to participate in meaningful ways. This means making sure they are listened to and taken seriously throughout. They're given information so that they can understand and feel comfortable during the process, and the decisions made in their best interests are those that take into account their views. It also means that the processes and procedures need to be adapted to be child-friendly and to facilitate children's participation. And this requires that everyone involved be trained in child development and trauma, children's rights, and how to engage with children. And many proposals to address these barriers in the current system are contained in the ALRC's discussion paper, including that much more use is made of mediation and dispute resolution processes rather than the adversarial processes of the formal courts, which appear to do much damage to many children and families, and that child-inclusive practices be ramped up across the board. This actually presents a massive opportunity to get things right, or at least better, so I encourage you all to be part of that work and drive the changes you think are most needed. For me, I've just recently reported to the United Nations on progress in meeting our obligations against the Child Rights Convention and made a number of recommendations to promote child rights in the Australian context. Again, this represents a significant opportunity to put Australia on notice and drive system change to the benefit of children. Before I wind up, I just want to also alert you to the national work I've been leading with the support of the Australian Government in relation to child-safe organisations. This has included the development of national principles for child-safe organisations and related training and resource material. This has flowed out of the Royal Commission and is the future-proofing piece for children who take part in services and systems. Another aspect, if you like, of leaving no child behind. The principles, which relate to everything from governance and culture, the participation of children and families, to effective child-safe policies and procedures and the training and expectation of staff and volunteers, should be a touchstone for all organisations working with children across the country to help ensure that what emerged from the Royal Commission, the terrible harms, the cover-ups and the silencing of children, never happens again. And this cannot happen without active change on our parts. A reorientation of our thinking about and valuing of children and their rights, and where children are genuinely at the centre of the services and systems that we're all a part of. Thank you.
I would, along with my colleagues, like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land as well, and I'd like to also say congratulations, FRSA, fabulous conference. Lovely for me to see so many old friends here. I've had a great time. It's harder to leave people behind if they're already travelling with you. This was a comment to me only yesterday by Dr. Rebecca Armstrong, one of my colleagues at the Institute, when reflecting on the theme of the conference. And I'm going to use that as my sort of thread through what I've got to say. What does it actually mean? Well, for me, it means stepping outside of our professional bubble as researchers or policymakers or service providers to engage with real people in order to understand more deeply what matters most to them, and to ensure our work is helping them to be empowered to achieve their own aspirations, not to just solve problems that have been defined by us. It's also about always reflecting on our own attitudes and our actions, like having the courage to experiment more and to be open about our failures, the evidence of failure, to be talking about that and learning from our failures, and adapting to living in the real world. And I just had to share this with you. I saw it in the Sydney Morning Herald day before yesterday. New South Wales people will have heard of Dr. Kevin Donnelly, who is an education academic, and he's been used to by the state government to review the curriculum and other important jobs. He said this: What we need is a return to 1950s Australia, where things were less complicated and children were happier. I just couldn't resist because the chair of this panel kept saying we need practical solutions, and I'm thinking, well, that ain't one. And we're not living in the real world if we think that. But I'm going to try out a few practical suggestions with you and some what-ifs in the real world. There are great services all around Australia, and many of them run by the people in this room. But as you know, it's patchy. It's a bit of a lottery depending on where you live in this big country. So a couple of no-brainers first. We need a better platform and scaffolding to help families to do their job well. This platform should be built on progressive universalism so that those who need more help can get it in a timely way. And that means earlier in the life of the problem, earlier in life, rather than reacting late. Applying a systems theory lens, it's also not just about individual services that matter, it's the pattern of connections between them. Like a tapestry where each thread needs to be strong and be well connected to create the whole picture. We also need to address income and housing security, the Senator's already talked about that, and proper needs-based funding, particularly in health and in education. As a former service provider for virtually my whole career, I have found it instructive to see research that shows most people don't actually use services. So, for example, the ABS General Social Attitude Survey found that 80% of people would turn to family or friends, only 20% use services. I think a similar figure was found in a previous evaluation of the family law services done by the Institute. And next week we're releasing some brand new data from the longitudinal study of Australia's children, which shows that teenagers who have personal and emotional problems, 3/4 of them would turn to family and friends, not to formal services, not even online services. So it's not all about services. And I'd argue that we collectively spend probably a little too much time on what I call the muddy middle of program land. And evaluating individual programs in isolation is insufficient for many reasons, including the fact that our lives are complex and multiple variables impact on how we live. We need to also interrogate the broader systems and structural issues that wrap around the family system, the broader policy arena. And at the other end of the spectrum, we need to put effort into a deeper understanding of what matters most to people themselves, so we ensure that we're travelling together on this journey. It would help if we measured the impact of policy on the well-being of children and families, like Canada does, a country quite similar to us, as you know, and we need COAG level commitment on agreed indicators to measure child and family well-being across the country. We have COAG commitments on domestic violence. Why not for child and family well-being? It's been done elsewhere, it can be done here. There is no direct route from research evidence to implementation to positive outcomes. If it was that simple, like apparently brain surgery is, we would have fixed it by now. So evidence, whilst critical, is not a magical solution. And we need to interrogate further. We need to understand evidence of what, for whom, and in what context. We need to understand not just what works, but why. Importantly, we need courage to take an experimental approach, to test our assumptions, our practices, and to honestly review how we're doing and speak openly about our failures. What if the service system was designed with people in mind? How would it look different? For example, if child and family health services were co-located with schools, like they are in countries like Finland, which, by the way, is an international leader in child health and in education. So it can be done, and it represents a culture that really values kids and the hard job that families are doing. Our federated system's often blamed, but I think we can try harder, don't you? In order to ensure that our systems and structures are designed with people in mind, we need to get closer to them and listen to them. We've already heard about the research on what kids think about the family law system. We heard Howard Barth talk about his colleague who'd grown up in out-of-home care, and what mattered most to him was being able to hang out with his mates and play basketball and learn to drive a car. We need to ask ourselves, who is defining the problems we're trying to solve? When designing policy and service systems, how well are we listening to the aspirations and experiences of people themselves? And by the way, that's all that mysterious word co-design means. It's about engaging and participating with people all along the way so that they can inform our policy and services. Finally, if you've been following the Financial Services Royal Commission lately, as I have been, the reporting this week has been quite interesting. You would have seen bank bosses admitting that they got distracted. Apparently they got distracted and they focused on the wrong things instead of their customers. That's a quote from one of the reports. They focused on the wrong things. And a headline for this week, we put profit ahead of people, right? But in thinking about this panel, I found myself wondering, what if there was an inquiry on our sector and the government investment and all the elements of our sector? And what would the headlines be if there was an inquiry? Might it be processes ahead of people, or we put programs ahead of people? I think it's worth thinking about and asking ourselves, how often are we focusing on the wrong things? Thank you very much.
Okay, as my colleagues have done before me, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and kind of recognise their continuing connection to it. I'd like to start by thanking everyone for the welcome that I've had. I said on Wednesday, I felt very privileged to have been invited here, and I feel incredibly privileged to have spent time in your company. It's been genuinely humbling, the welcome that you've afforded me, so thank you very, very much for that. I'm not going to cry, don't worry. Okay. The theme of the panel is Be the Change, Leave No One Behind. Gandhi argued that we should be the change. I'm not going to argue with Gandhi. But I do think that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to change. I've seen evidence before my own eyes these past 3 days that you need to keep doing what you are doing in many cases. You don't need to buy into the idea that we need to be innovative or that your services need to be transformed. In many cases, you need to stick to your guns, not necessarily go back to the 50s, but there is, I think, something to be said for we know the kinds of things that work, and we don't always need to be innovative or transformational in order for things to improve. In terms of leaving no one behind, I'm going to bang a similar drum to what I did on Wednesday, unfortunately, but I'm hoping to change my tune a little bit by the end. I think there is a potentially problematic reading of the idea that we leave no one behind. One is that it affords the potential to view a group of people as being slower than us, or more backwards, and kind of being a burden on the rest of society. And I don't need to labour the point to this audience of the dangers of kind of categorising certain communities in that way. In the UK, it is white working class communities, often ex-mining communities or deindustrialised communities, who are portrayed as being stuck in their ways and not possessing the skills or capacities in order to keep pace with the rest of us. And it's kind of the implication can often be that we, kind of this homogeneous mass of society, could make swifter progress if it wasn't for them. This is really, really dangerous, and there's a potential reading that others, small groups of people. It also suggests that we're making progress, that we're moving in the right direction, and that we're moving at an appropriate pace. Certainly my perspective in the UK is that we're not a progressive society. I'd even argue that we're not a particularly civilised society. I don't think the direction in which we're moving is one that we should continue down. We're definitely not on the right path. It also keeps the focus on those people that are potentially left behind and what we as a wider group can do to help them catch up. When maybe Others are preventing them from catching up. Maybe there are less visible forces that are preventing these people from kind of fully participating in society. What if a small group of people was stealing and hoarding the resources that these people needed in order to fully participate? Finally, on the kind of the downside, before I get on to the good bit, one of the best critiques of the concept of social inclusion and social exclusion that I've heard is that it suggests two groups, two homogeneous groups. You're either excluded or you're included. And once you're included, everything is fine. So it deflects attention away from the inequalities within wider society. Why are we talking about the people that are left behind? Why is there no focus on the people that are speeding ahead, the 1% that have jumped into their kind of sports cars and are leaving the rest of us behind and are tearing society apart? So this idea that you're either in this group or you're left behind, I think, is potentially problematic as well. However, I don't for one moment think that that is the way that it's been interpreted here. There is an alternative reading, which is far more about care and solidarity and reciprocity. And I think that is what I've experienced in the workshops and the presentations that I've seen this week. I attended a really, really powerful participatory action research workshop yesterday where young people had been involved in researching and evaluating a service and then had been involved in implementing the changes that, and the kind of the practical solutions that came out of that in order to improve the service, and that was being done continually. I'm quite sceptical of participatory action research. The presenter kind of gave such a really good, powerful discussion around it that all the questions that I generally have had been answered. It was a really compelling and powerful piece of work. There was a workshop on Wednesday about leading from behind, about the skills that Aboriginal communities already have in their power to deal with some of the trauma that they have faced. We don't need, the presenter argued that we don't necessarily need to look to white European men again for the solution of many of the problems that they've caused, and that skills, knowledge, culture, practices are already there. I also heard about a game this morning that being co-designed with young people leaving care, a game, an app that kind of sought to give them the information that they need in a format that was accessible and well known to them. I said at the start, you've been superb. I hope I don't incur your wrath by mentioning the New Zealand rugby team. A while back, I used to coach football for a living a long time ago, and I watched a video that was produced by the New Zealand rugby team called Lessons to be Learned from Flying with Geese, and it had a profound impact on me. And it links to the quote that Anne used, that it's harder to leave people behind when they're travelling with you. And it was a short, kind of 5-minute motivational video about how geese accept that all members of their group will from time to time fall behind and will from time to time need a little bit of protection and extra support and care. They acknowledge the dynamics of the group, which I think it's interesting. In the UK, poverty and disadvantage is a very dynamic process. We do not have a hardcore disadvantaged groups at all. The numbers stay constant, but the people in those groups churn in and out of poverty. And I thought it was really interesting, kind of, we can learn a lot from flying with geese. They don't let those that are struggling drop out or fly behind. They have various manoeuvres and they adapt what they are doing in order to ensure that people keep pace. The good news is it's really, really so easy to solve some of the problems we have. All that is required is for politicians to take action, I think. Martin Luther King, far more intelligent than I am, far more influential, argued that in order for poverty to be eradicated, rich people just had to accept being rich or getting richer slightly less quickly. And that was in the US in the 1960s. It's still that's exactly the case in the US. It's a case in the UK. I'd argue it's probably the case in Australia, where the rich are getting richer. And if they were happy to just get rich a little bit more slowly, there would be far more money to go around. Governments and politicians in the UK and I think in Australia like to talk about collaboration, and that is obviously very, very important. But let us not forget that it is politicians that hold the levers around poverty. Politicians and governments decide on the distribution and redistribution of resources in society, and that is particularly the truth for the poorest sections of our community. So politicians can decide how to redistribute wealth, but they cannot deny that they have the ultimate power. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm sure you'll agree that we've got a lot of stimulation from our wonderful panel today, and I'm just going to kick off with a couple of questions, but I want to leave most of the time to you and to hear what you have to say, to hear your voices. So let me just start with you, Jenny, if you don't mind. You were really advocating for government-community partnerships, which is a really heartening thing to hear. But I did get slightly unsettled when I heard you use the words shared responsibility, because certainly in my experience that's been a code word for funding cuts or benefit cuts. And so I'm just wondering, how much capacity do you really think government has for being a true partner, an equal partner?
I wasn't aware of the secret code.
Sorry.
What I'm really, and so to be very clear, I'm not talking about cuts. I'm talking about government and the public service and the leaders of the public service, people in my position, should we form a government, taking responsibility for genuinely examining the challenges that we're trying to solve in partnership with the community sector and coming up with workable solutions. And when I speak about responsibility in that context, I think I'm talking about making sure that the accountability rolls right up to the top and isn't actually pushed out to some third party who actually doesn't have the means or the tools to, as you allude to, change the resource allocation or any number of other things. I do think that there are excellent people in the public service, and I was a public servant at one point in my career, and it's, you know, one of the most rewarding, periods of my life was working in the New South Wales Public Service. I really believe in the public service. I think it's very obvious that repeated public service cuts have cut the ability of the public service to do some of that creative partnering that it might once have done. And one of the things we've been very clear about in opposition is that we would like to see a rebuilding of public sector capability, and that means removing things like arbitrary caps on public service numbers, and actually ending some of the over-reliance on consultants, making sure that departments actually do have the tools that and the resources that they need to do their job, and some permission to take some of the risks that other panellists have alluded to in kind of confronting failure, taking responsibility for it and moving on from it. Helpful answer?
Yeah, thank you. And we'd welcome that change, because one thing we notice about the public service is the churn too, and how difficult it is to develop deep relationships with them when they're in a different job next week.
Yeah, and there are wonderful, wonderful people working in the public service, but they need to be given permission to do the job they'd like to do, which I think is to deliver for the people of Australia, rather than spend a lot of time contract managing or retendering in ways that are very, very narrow and not particularly focused on the outcome we all might want to achieve.
Yeah. So I might throw to you now, Stephen, if you don't mind, because you talked a lot about the public service reforms and the policy reforms in the UK. And I wonder if you just got a few tips on what we should definitely avoid in the move towards change in policy impact.
Okay, so for this audience, perhaps one of the most depressing aspects of welfare reform in the UK is that the cuts to benefits have been targeted at families with children. And Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty, who I mentioned on Wednesday, who's just concluded an investigation into extreme poverty in the UK, was unequivocal that that was a political choice. Again, I think, as I mentioned, one of his remarks was that if you put a bunch of misogynists into a room and asked them to come up with a raft of policies that targeted women and left men pretty much unaffected, they would come up with something very similar to what the UK has done. So if there is the need for welfare reform, and I would argue there isn't, there are ways of doing that that can protect certain groups, and this audience would obviously want families with children to be protected from that. But there are, again, just don't look to the UK for what you do. There are far better ways of doing. That's the key message. Look to a place like Scandinavia, look to some of your own communities, look to some of the work that you're already doing and shout about that. And if anybody ever says in the UK, just stop listening or shout them down. It's genuinely, this is, do not go down the path that we have gone down is the best advice. And there is lots of one thing. So somebody said, I had an enlightening discussion with somebody where we talked about policies being transferred and policies making the journey internationally, different countries implementing very similar policies. Unfortunately, the research and the evidence doesn't seem to make the same journey, or doesn't seem to be given as high profile, because everything we've done in the UK we know doesn't work. We can tell you that. So yeah.
Yeah. Actually, and that's an interesting question for you as head of AFES. What capacity do you think governments do have to pay attention to the evidence? So, you know, like there are examples of, say, child detention, and that seem to make it pretty obvious that they don't really listen to evidence when they're making political decisions. Mm-hmm. How do you feel as, you know, head of AFES, you've got an influence on that?
Wow, I have to be very careful now, don't I, with my comment?
Sorry to put your foot on the spot.
Look, but it's a really important question, and in fact, probably Stephen and I spent most of last night discussing the impact of research question, because it isn't a straight line impact, and you know, at the political level, there are a lot of factors that have to be weighed up, and whilst there's a call for evidence, it's not always a straight line thing to implement the evidence that's there. It's complex, is the best thing that I could say. But I can point to examples where there's been direct impact from our work, and there's one recent one, and that is the legislation on direct cross-examination of domestic violence victims. And that was a piece of work that AFES did that is now being framed into legislation that's being debated in Parliament. I don't think it's been passed yet, but I think it probably will. And so there you can see that the evidence is being looked at, and it is going to go hopefully into legislation very soon. So sometimes it works pretty well, other times it's a lot more complicated. I'm sure Jenny understands that better than anybody.
Yeah, so Jenny, let's bring you into this, because you said children know what they want and they need to be heard. Sorry, Megan. Megan,
But I would have said
that. You would have said that
Jenny
too,
agrees.
yeah. But Megan actually said it. And I'd like to hear a bit more about what it would really look like if children were heard, because we have some fears around children being heard, that it might be dangerous for them, put them at risk. What do you think about that?
My position is very much that silenced children are never protected children, and I think we just saw that so clearly through the Royal Commission. You know, that the system was risk averse because of its own reputation, not because it was focusing on the needs and interests of children. And I think we need to reorient our thinking towards, well, how does that work for children? Now, children mightn't want to give their views in every circumstances, but to disempower them in ways that sort of suppresses their capability and their growth and development of human being, and that treats them as lesser somehow, and that their views aren't legitimate as evolving human beings, I think just denies their human dignity, makes them passive recipients of a service system rather than active agents in their lives. You know, and as Anne said, they're not like families. They're not all running around accessing services all the time, or at least the services we think of. They're in the real world. They're, you know, playing sport. They're, you know, they're going to school. They're getting health care, all of that sort of stuff. They're in the private sector. They're in all the places that families go. And they really, the key thing that we can do for them is empower them to make choices and decisions in those contexts. And that means us not seeing them as, vulnerable people, as Stephen talked about, that we do something with and help try and move them along and speed them up. It's that we share a human condition, we share human dignity, and we need to be encouraging that genuine engagement that recognises that, they're equal human beings to us all, and so it's building capacity for them to go about their lives, and that's where we should all be, I think, trying to head for families and for kids as well.
Yeah, thank you. That was a really good comment. Let's open it up to your questions and thoughts about being the change.
Hi, Tori Cook from Relationships Australia Victoria. I'm the practice specialist for family violence and child safety. One of the things that is a significant shift as a result of the Victorian Royal Commission is a much stronger focus on the source of the problem and a much greater investment into men's behaviour change programs. And, I head up the clinical team that does an enormous amount of work across the state in relation to men's behaviour change programs. I think, in terms of working with child safety and working with family safety, there's a layer of accountability in relation to men who are perpetrating family violence, and getting really clear about strong investment in that space. And I'm just wondering about, the panel's response to shifting our theoretical understanding from, managing the crisis to investment in, prevention initiatives. We know in our industry that when we work, that the average perpetrator will perpetrate against 5 women in his lifetime. So we know 5 women in his lifetime. So when we work with someone, it's his first or second relationship, we're doing a huge amount of prevention work in, the potential for 3 or 4 other women to be affected by that man's violence. So from my perspective, having that clear shift from managing a crisis, high-level victim blaming, community victim blaming, and our community's default position is to actually support perpetrators through a whole range of different mythologies, hence the need for prevention campaigns that target perpetrators rather than invite women into services. I guess I'm really interested in the panel's thinking around, that more recent shift and some of the difficulties and challenges that come with that shift. And we are often having to deal with, but women are violent too, without really understanding the nuances of that violence, and having those broader conversations that are more meaningful and more evidence-based around what works. So just really keen to, hear what your thoughts are on, on really working with the source of the problem in family violence rather than constantly getting women to phone 1800-RESPECT, which is fine, but you can put a refuge on every street, but that will never solve the problem.
Thanks. Do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Jenny, do you want to go first?
And you're very welcome to.
No, you can.
I think your question, in some ways goes to... One of the things I think is socially interesting is that over the last decade we've come to some public understanding of the prevalence of violence in institutions and in families and in workplaces against women. And I don't believe that as a society we've really yet come to grips with what that prevalence means. Because in the past I think it was possible to isolate perpetrators and say it's a very small group of very, very bad people, and we have an answer historically to how we deal with such people. We jail them. And I think what the prevalence of violence tells us is that we may need a broader range of tools to intervene and to reduce and perhaps eliminate violence at some point. And that does require new kinds of interventions. I think I'm interested in what's happening in terms of men's behaviour change and I have talked to quite a number of people since taking the portfolio to better understand what we know about it and what we don't know about it. We're at a very early phase in learning how to do this, and I imagine there's going to have to be some trial and error. I think some of the hesitation of course, comes about from a concern that we divert resources from women and from crisis to another group of people. I think perhaps we have to move to a point where we don't see those two things as a choice.
Yeah. Do you want to pick up on that?
Okay, this is such a big
It is a
topic
big
and I
topic.
feel really nervous. I feel really
Yes.
nervous saying anything, but we're in your hands. You can move it on quickly if we need to. I agree with you, Jenny. I've spent a lot of my career in the domestic violence field from frontline practice, etc., and now I'm on the New South Wales Council for Domestic and Family Violence and Sexual Assault, so I'm still sort of involved at that level now. And I would just like to make one observation, and that is that I think there's been a lot of progress that we've made in many ways. I mean, there's huge amounts still to do, but one of the things that I think is still hard to talk about is men and understanding men better. And I've been in forums where I've said that, something like that, and I've been held down as, oh, you're going soft on men. And actually, I'm not. I hold a very strong zero tolerance to violence position, but I don't think we've nailed the understanding of how to really drive change with men. And unless we invest in it, we're not going to. But I don't think politically, party politically, I mean just generally politically, I don't think we're there yet to be able to invest what needs to be invested for that next stage. So I find, look, it happened just recently. I was tackled for having said something about we need to spend a bit more time trying to understand men. It's not okay to say that yet. So I've said it now, and I'm nervous.
I think you've got a lot of support for the idea that men could be part of the solution as well as part of the problem. And that's something at the Family Action Centre in our fatherhood work we hold quite dear. And I think that the universal approaches to great relationships at the beginning and the prevention end is an area where you should spend a lot more work on, as well as doing the really complicated work of how you resolve violence in the whole of society.
And can I just add very quickly that, don't get me wrong, I agree with respectful relationships programs and the gender equality measure, all of that. Of course it's important, but I don't think that ultimately that will be enough, and I think there will come a time when we need to dig a little deeper as well, and that will require some investment, and I don't know when we'll be ready to do that.
Thanks, Anne.
I wanted to make the point that I agree with Jenny that I think we need a suite of responses to this issue, and I do think the behaviour change space is part of that. And when I looked at the issue of family violence and children a few years ago, the unique sort of or distinct impacts on kids, it was clear that there was some very promising practice in this area, and that when adults, in particular in terms of the restoration or the quality of the relationship with their children, was a lever for potential behaviour change in men and possibly women as well, in that one, people weren't necessarily aware of the deep impact they were having on their kids in a negative way, and so we really need adults to understand this more. And two, they were very motivated to restore or have a good relationship with their children, even if the other bit of the partner relationship was sort of toxic. That was a real opportunity to leave a change. So I do think, and there's a lot of promising evidence coming out of that. We need to build that evidence to make sure we've got it right, because I do think it's still a new area, but I think there's a lot of potential there, personally.
Thank you.
Thanks, panel. My name's Tony Pietropiccolo. I'm the Director of Centre Care in Perth, but also I'm asking this question with my hat on of Children Initiative, Valuing Children Initiative. Both to Megan and our Minister. We know we've got about 7,000 children living in poverty at the moment, give or take 50,000. We have significant reports on children's mental health. the increasing depression among children, a whole heap of other indicators that aren't very pleasant to read. We also know that with the reports you've done, Megan, about how children view themselves and the society in which they live, feeling unsafe, often feeling as though they're not listened to. So it places children in a particular spot within Australian society. The issue is, despite all that we know about what is happening, all the reports, all the facts, nothing much seems to change. So there are two aspects to this. One is, from your perspective, Megan.
Could you please hurry it along a little bit, please?
It's fine, but I need to frame it so that you can understand the question. Just like from Megan's point of view, whether or not, in terms of your understanding of what is the impediment to implementing, changes, and to Assistant Minister, what you believe are the political impediments to affecting change.
Thank you, and I'm sorry, I'm
very
going to have
quick.
to
I'll
ask
be
you
very quick.
your answers. Be
Look,
brief
I don't
too.
think I've got the answer to that. I think we all collectively should be thinking about why the community doesn't value children and focus on children in the way that we should, and the outcomes for them. Partly we don't measure stuff well enough that we even know what's happening for them, so we need to change that. We don't have national plan for children, we don't have a charter of rights, we have a lot of missing architecture that we need in order to help focus our attention. They don't vote, so, they're not powerful in the community as well. And that's why all of you are so important to be thinking about being champions of children's rights now and into the future. And I'm a glass half full girl too, so I really do believe together we can actually make advances. And there are areas where things are happening, and I think we need to be latching onto those and looking at why they're successful and where the areas we aren't successful are, and creating a plan to drive us forward in this area in terms of child wellbeing.
Thanks, Jenny, final comment?
I think we are at a really interesting stage in Australia and globally where there is interest in addressing questions around inequality and disadvantage. That's not always the environment that you're working in politics. In fact, most of the time that I've been a sort of member of the Labor Party, my set of views about the importance of those questions has not been the dominant social view at all. I suppose I would say that I think that there is a political opportunity now to capture the public imagination by saying, okay, if people want to talk about inequality, if people want to talk about disadvantage, here we are as researchers and practitioners and advocates, here are some concrete things that we think could make a difference. And I think the time for advocacy is now, because there is a public appetite for change. That's my optimistic glass half full view, but you've got to be optimistic in my line of work or you wouldn't do it.
Thank you. We're not going to sum up because we've had a really rich and wonderful discussion, and I think this final plenary has thrown out some challenges to us about the road ahead, but it's definitely given us optimism that we can be the change, and we've got senators asking for us to beat down her door, and we've got advocates and researchers wanting to walk alongside us. So won't you thank them all?
A couple of words that I've heard quite often in coming around and chatting to people is invigorating and re-energising, and I think after hearing that discussion, if we don't walk away from this conference continuing to feel invigorated and re-energised about all the various presentations we've heard and seen and been part of, I think we're missing an opportunity. So I hope that you embrace that and take it with you as you leave today. So thank you to Deb for chairing that particular session. I'm going to do a little bit of a wrap up in a logistical sense, and then we just have a couple of short speeches, and then Michael will do the final wrap-up. So if you can just bear with me for another 10 minutes or so. Thank you. I would like to acknowledge before we wind up that we are here experiencing this wonderful conference by virtue of the fact that we've had some very fine sponsors come on board with us this year, and my thanks to them particularly. We have the Department of Social Services, who've also had a strong representation here at the conference, so my thanks to the department and the staff who've been here for being here. Attorney General's Department as well. I know that those who were here were slightly left of field of our normal points of engagement within the Attorney General's Department, but I'm sure that they will be sharing much of what they have heard and learnt here today with their colleagues when they return to Canberra. Our gold sponsors were Better Place Australia, Uniting Care, Drummond Street Services. Our silver sponsor was Interrelate. Our mobile office sponsor was Anglicare. And of course our exhibitors, who you've all taken the opportunity to go and speak with, no doubt, Relationships Australia Queensland, Guild Insurance, the Australian Institute of Social Relations, the College of Law, Centrecare North Queensland, Emerging Minds, CSNet, Athena, the University of Newcastle, Our Family Wizard, My Life, My Super, 1-800-RESPECT, and Untying the Knot. And really importantly, without them, we would not be able to present the event that we do. So particular thanks and thank you. And also our reciprocal sponsors, the Australian Institute of Family Studies and SNAKE, the national voice of our children. If you missed dinner, you missed something pretty special. But for those of you who missed the AGM this morning, you missed something pretty amazing. As part of our AGM, it is general business for the organisation, but it also the place that we have the announcement of the results of our election for the board. So this year for the board we had 3 positions that were declared vacant. Michael Austin was stepping off the board, having served as a member and chair of the board for 6 years. We also had Sue Christophers from Anglicare SA and Paula Washington from Centrecare North Queensland, whose time, the 2-year duration of those terms had expired. And as a result of the election that was conducted by the Australian Election Company, we have 3 appointed members of the board. Paula Washington, who is the Director of Strategy and Partnerships at Centrecare North Queensland, was reappointed to the board. Tony Fitzgerald, is CEO of Centrecare Ballarat, is a new incoming member of the board, as is Teresa Jayette, who is CEO of Mallee Family Care. So please join me in congratulating them for being elected to their board. Of course, we will see Michael and Sue Christophers from Anglicare SA step off the board, but as reflected this morning, everybody who has some time on the board certainly leaves a legacy of the work and the input that they've made into the life and times of the organisation whilst they have been there. So I've certainly enjoyed working with both Sue and with Michael, so my personal thanks to you both through your time, and in particular thanks to Michael. I think Michael, you reflected this morning that the relationship between a chair and a CEO is quite a unique one, and I'm quite glad that I made that journey with you, given that it was my first role as a CEO in the fullness of that role. And thank you very much for your mentoring, your guidance, your support, your candour, and also your representation of leadership of the FRSA network and organisation. It's been a pleasure to work with you. So that's it from me, but I will invite Marie and Deb up to the podium just to make a few comments, please.
So as Jackie said, Michael has been chair of our board for 6 years. That's the maximum term anyone can spend on the board. And during that time, both Deb and I have worked with him as board members in various roles for 5 years. I think during his time as chair, Michael's brought considerable stability to the FRSA, both at an organisational level and a board level and at a secretariat level. He was involved in both selecting and mentoring Jackie into the Executive Director position, and we're very grateful for his selection of Jackie. She is really undertaking her position very, very competently, and we're grateful that Michael was involved in choosing her and working closely with her. I think Michael has had a very stabilising influence. He's very professional and he's very collaborative, and he's shown great leadership qualities. He has wonderful governance skills on many levels, from chairing meetings to representing us both internally and externally. He's a really warm and compassionate person, and it's been a total pleasure to work with him. And he's always considerate, and I think he shows great integrity in his approach. I think it's a difficult role to be in a governance position of a peak organisation with so many members, and I think I've always noticed that Michael puts his own organisation and his own interests aside and has really worked in a true governance capacity for the whole of the FRSA. I will miss you greatly, Michael. We'll all miss you, I think. You've been a great leader for our board and for our organisation, and I wish you well.
And Michael, I just want to echo those words of Marie. We've worked together for 5 years on this board, and you have been a calm in the storm. There were some pretty turbulent times, both on the board and in the sector in those years that we've worked together. And Michael genuinely steered us on a fantastic, stable course that has led us to be in a really good position where we have the respect of government, we have a great membership, and we have the respect of the sector. So, Michael, that's down to you. And it's been a privilege working with you. And we know that you've put aside some of your family commitments to spend time on the board, spend time working with Jackie, and spend time at the meetings and doing the work. You've had a baby, you've grown a teenager, and you've changed jobs. You've had a rich and full life, as well as being an exemplary chair of the board. We're all going to miss you.
Thank you so much for those lovely, warm comments, Jackie and Marie and Deb. It's been a wonderful privilege to be on the chair of FRSA, and certainly an extreme privilege to be the chair of it for 6 years. I think relationships and communities are both resilient and they're very delicate, and they're things to be cherished and nurtured. And I think all of us in this room share that commitment. The services we provide, because we know it's important and it's just so valuable. And to be elected by your peers from a sector that does this amazing work is just a huge and absolute honour. And I did say this morning at the AGM that there's not a week in this 6 years that I have not reflected on the wonderful privilege that this has been, and the responsibility of that position that I've approached with the best that I can bring to it, and it's been just a real delight and a tremendous honour. One of the things that we all agreed was very important when we formed the board, when I joined, it is a sector role, and it's not about representing your own organisation or a sub-network, it's about the sector as a whole. And being really clear about that is really critical, and every board member on our team has had that approach. It's been important that we had a culture where everyone's talents could come to the surface and be respected and valued, but also work as a team. And I really thank my colleagues for that wonderful teamwork. And there were a few, squalls every now and then that we had to navigate, but we did that very effectively, I believe, as a team, and that's because it's been a team, and a team of fantastic people. Jackie's been a fantastic and absolutely wonderful executive director, and I'd shared this morning at the AGM the delight I had in receiving the phone call from her 3 days before the applications closed for the position, and she said she was interested. So I thought, great, and and I think the rest is history in terms of Jackie's demonstration of leadership for us. I wanted to also just acknowledge my wife Karen and our children, because yes, and as we shared during that time, as Deb outlined, there's been another child joined our family, and and my wife's at home all this week, balancing work and looking after the children for a whole week. So I really cherish and value all her wonderful support to me, and I think to feel the support of the members, our members generally, I've really thank you for your generosity and your support, and I think we've managed, I think as a sector, this is our second decade that we're entering. We've come back to the place from which we began, really, where we launched FRSA, and I think we look to the second decade with wonderful optimism of the work that we do in our sector. I'd really like to thank Sue Christophers for her wonderful contribution over 4 years, and she brought lots of amazing talents, great teamwork approach, that knowledge of the communities for children, which I think has been an enormous value add to the board, and that South Australia perspective and so on has been really invaluable. I thank all of my board colleagues, Deb and Marie, Serge, whereas I can't sort of see in the light here, Paula. I've thanked Sue. Matt, I think, has had to go, leave this morning, but Glenda, because Glenda's still here. Yes, there's Glenda. Thank you. Yeah. So it's been a fantastic board, and I just really want to thank everyone, and it's been a tremendous privilege, as I said, and I really wish the new board all the very best in your deliberations, and I know that the FRSA will continue to grow from strength to strength, and thank you everyone for this conference. There's been a wonderful energy and sense of participation, and if you look at the showcased work in all those concurrent sessions, there's some fabulous work going on and fabulous people. So I'm going to put in a plug for encouraging you to think about nominating for the board in the future. We're blessed with very talented people in our sector, and we're always looking for good people to nominate for the board. So look, thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing my involvement as a member in the future, and I guess on that note, I'll thank you and close the conference, and wish you all the best in your travels home, and let's take this message of Be the Change with us as we go into the future. So thank you, everyone.